Imagine this. You have been fighting for 3 solid months. You are starving. You are sick with malaria and dysentery. Your body is riddled with wounds. You have eaten nothing but monkey meat and a few grains of rice for weeks. And then your commander tells you to surrender. To lay down your arms. To an enemy that does not believe in surrender. An enemy that views it as the ultimate disgrace. An enemy that is about to force you on a 65-mile march through hell itself. That is exactly what happened to 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers in April of 1942. Welcome. Today we are diving into one of the most brutal, most horrific, and most criminally unjust atrocities of the entire Second World War. This is the story of the Bataan Death March. 76,000 men started the march. Only 54,000 made it to the camp alive. And tens of thousands more would die in the months that followed. This is not a story for the faint of heart. But it is a story that must be told. So let us begin. To understand the Bataan Death March, we have to go back to December of 1941. Specifically, December 7th. The day that will live in infamy. The day Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and dragged the United States into the Second World War. But Pearl Harbor was not Japan's only target that day. Less than 10 hours after the attack on Hawaii, Japanese forces launched a massive invasion of the Philippines. The Philippines were absolutely critical to Japan's strategy in the Pacific. Manila Bay, the capital's deepwater harbor, was one of the best resupply points in the entire region. If Japan could take the Philippines, they would be one step closer to controlling the entire Southwest Pacific. And so on December 22, 1941, 43,000 men of the Imperial Japanese 14th Army went ashore on Luzon, the largest island in the Philippine archipelago. Waiting for them were American and Filipino forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur commanded roughly 130,000 troops. That sounds like a lot. But the truth is, most of those men were poorly equipped, poorly trained Philippine Army conscripts. They had obsolete World War I-era weapons. They had almost no air support. They had virtually no naval support. And they were about to face one of the most ruthless, most disciplined, and most experienced fighting forces in the world. MacArthur's original plan had been to defend the entire Philippine archipelago. He believed he could hold off the Japanese invasion force across all the islands. But within days of the initial Japanese landings, that plan fell apart. The Japanese advance was too fast, too coordinated, too overwhelming. American and Filipino forces were being pushed back on all fronts. And so MacArthur made the decision to fall back to the Bataan Peninsula, a rugged, jungle-covered stretch of land on the western side of Luzon that jutted out into Manila Bay. The withdrawal to Bataan was part of an older American contingency plan called War Plan Orange 3. The idea was simple. If the Japanese got the upper hand, American and Filipino forces would retreat to Bataan and the island fortress of Corregidor, which sat at the mouth of Manila Bay. From there, they would hold out until reinforcements could arrive from the United States. It was a defensive strategy. A delaying strategy. A strategy built on the assumption that help was coming. But help was not coming. By early January 1942, approximately 80,000 American and Filipino troops, along with 26,000 civilian refugees, were crammed onto the Bataan Peninsula. They were cut off. Supplies that MacArthur had promised would be waiting for them on Bataan were not there. He had miscalculated. Badly. Tons of rice, ammunition, medical supplies, and other critical stores had been left behind during the chaotic retreat. The men on Bataan were immediately put on half rations. Then quarter rations. Then whatever they could scrounge. The conditions were nightmarish from the very beginning. The jungle was thick, humid, and crawling with disease. Malaria swept through the ranks like wildfire. Dengue fever followed. Dysentery became so common that nearly every man had it. Soldiers were losing weight at an alarming rate. Their skin turned yellow. Their eyes became hollow. They were walking skeletons, many of them, and they were expected to fight a modern, well-supplied Japanese army. And fight they did. For 99 days, those American and Filipino defenders held the line on Bataan. Japan had planned to take the peninsula in 50 days. It took them 3 months. The Battle of Bataan became one of the most stubborn, most heroic defensive stands of the entire Pacific War. But heroism does not stop bullets. Courage does not cure malaria. And by early April 1942, it was clear that the end was near. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward P. King, the commander of American forces on Bataan, made the hardest decision of his life. Against the direct orders of his superior, General MacArthur, King surrendered. He told his men, "You did not surrender. You had no alternative but to obey my order." He was trying to protect them. He was trying to take the responsibility onto his own shoulders. He thought that by surrendering, he might save their lives. He could not have been more wrong. What happened next was the Bataan Death March. And it remains, to this day, one of the single worst war crimes committed during the Second World War. When General King surrendered on the morning of April 9, the Japanese found themselves with a massive, unexpected problem. They had estimated that they would be taking around 25,000 prisoners. Instead, they had just captured approximately 76,000 men. 12,000 Americans and 64 to 66,000 Filipinos. That is 3 times more prisoners than they had planned for. And the Japanese were completely, catastrophically unprepared to handle them. The plan, such as it was to move all of these prisoners from the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula, a town called Maribles, north to a prison camp called Camp O'Donnell. The total distance was about 65 miles. Under normal circumstances, with healthy, well-fed men, it would have been a difficult but manageable march. But these were not normal circumstances. And these were not healthy men. The American and Filipino prisoners were already starving. They were already sick. They were already wounded. Many could barely stand, let alone walk 65 miles. And the Japanese guards assigned to move them had no intention of making it easy. In fact, the opposite was true. The march began on April 10, 1942. The prisoners were organized into groups of roughly 100 men each. They were told to empty their pockets and surrender anything of value. Watches, rings, money, photographs. Anything. And here is where the first killings began. If a Japanese guard found Japanese money or Japanese souvenirs in a prisoner's possession, that prisoner was immediately accused of having looted it from a dead Japanese soldier. The punishment was instant execution. Survivors later testified that men were dragged behind rice shacks and shot in the head or bayonet to death, right there, in front of everyone. Word spread quickly among the prisoners. Get rid of anything Japanese. Throw it away. Bury it. Or you will die. Then the march itself began. The first 5 miles were uphill. Uphill in the blazing tropical sun. Uphill with no water. Uphill with no food. Uphill with Japanese guards beating anyone who slowed down. Survivor accounts describe guards using short whips, rifle butts, and bayonets to keep the column moving. If you stumbled, you were beaten. If you fell, you were killed. And the heat was unimaginable. April is one of the hottest months in the Philippines. Temperatures regularly soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity was crushing. Men were drenched in sweat within minutes. Their bodies were already dehydrated from months of malnutrition. And now they were being forced to march hour after hour, with no water. Survivors reported seeing artesian wells and water pumps along the road. Fresh, clean water. Right there. But if any prisoner tried to break ranks and drink, Japanese guards would shoot them on the spot or bayonet them. Some guards would stand next to the wells, taunting the prisoners, pouring the water out onto the ground, just to watch them suffer. One survivor, Lieutenant Lester Tenney, later described the march in an oral history interview. He said, "It was not a march. It was a trudge. Most of the men were sick. They had dysentery. They had malaria. They had gunshot wounds. And you just kept walking the best way you could." He went on to describe watching a man fall down beside him. A Japanese guard did not even shout at the man. He just walked over, put a bayonet in him, and kept moving. 2 seconds, Tenney said. That is all it took. And it happened constantly. All day. Every day. Men who could not keep up were executed on the spot. Men who asked for water were beaten to death. Men who tried to help their fallen comrades were bayoneted. And the bodies were simply left on the side of the road. Thousands of them. Lying in the dirt. Rotting in the sun. But it got worse. The Japanese had trucks and military vehicles moving up and down the same roads the prisoners were marching on. And when those trucks came upon a prisoner who had collapsed in the road, the drivers did not stop. They did not swerve. They drove over them. Deliberately. Survivor Glenn Frazier testified years later that he watched trucks go out of their way to run over men lying in the road. And when you have 15 or 20 trucks run over you, he said, you look like a smashed tomato. There was also something the survivors called the sun treatment. It was a form of torture. Japanese guards would force groups of prisoners to sit in the direct, blazing sun for hours. No hats. No helmets. No shade. No water. Just sitting there. Anyone who moved was beaten. Anyone who spoke was shot. The men sat there, their skin blistering, their brains cooking in their skulls, until some of them simply passed out and died where they sat. And then there were the mass executions. At a place called the Pantingan River, somewhere between 350 and 400 Filipino officers were separated from the main group of prisoners. They were marched to the riverbank. And they were systematically executed. Shot. Bayonet. Beheaded. Their bodies thrown into the river. It was later discovered that this massacre had been secretly ordered by Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a high-ranking Japanese officer, even though the commanding general, Homa Masaharu, had wanted the prisoners transferred peacefully. The march took anywhere from 5 to 10 days, depending on where a prisoner started and how fast their group was forced to move. Every single day was a nightmare. Every single mile was agony. And with each passing hour, more men died. Survivor accounts describe hallucinations brought on by dehydration and heat exhaustion. Men thought they saw water where there was none. They thought they saw their families. Some men became completely delirious and started attacking their own comrades, convinced they were Japanese soldiers. Others simply gave up. They sat down in the road and waited to die. And the guards obliged them. By the time the survivors reached the town of San Fernando, roughly 55 miles into the march, they had been walking for days. They were skeletal. They were covered in filth. They were barely conscious. And then the Japanese packed them into boxcars. These were not passenger cars. They were steel-sided freight cars, the kind used to transport cargo. The temperature inside those cars, in the tropical heat, quickly rose to over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The prisoners were packed in so tightly that they could barely move. There was no ventilation. No water. No toilets. Men urinated and defecated where they stood. The smell was unbearable. The heat was suffocating. And men began to die. They died standing up. Because they were packed so tightly, the dead could not fall. They just stood there, wedged between the living, as the train rolled north for 4 hours. Survivors later said that when the doors finally opened at the town of Capas, bodies tumbled out onto the platform like cordwood. But the ordeal was not over. From Capas, the prisoners still had to walk another 9 to 10 miles to reach Camp O'Donnell, their final destination. By this point, many men were barely able to put one foot in front of the other. Some crawled. Some were carried by their comrades. And some simply collapsed and died on that final stretch of road. When the survivors finally stumbled through the gates of Camp O'Donnell, they were met by a Japanese officer who screamed at them. "You are not prisoners of war," he shouted. "You are captives. And you will be treated like captives." And he meant it. Camp O'Donnell was a former Philippine Army training facility. It had been designed to house maybe 9,000 men under normal conditions. The Japanese crammed tens of thousands of prisoners into it. There were not enough barracks. There was not enough food. There was not enough water. There was almost no medical care. The sanitation was non-existent. Disease spread like wildfire. Men died by the hundreds every single day. In the first 2 months at Camp O'Donnell, approximately 1,500 American prisoners and over 26,000 Filipino prisoners died. 1,500 Americans. 26,000 Filipinos. In 2 months. That is several hundred deaths every single day. The causes of death were predictable. Dysentery. Malaria. Beriberi. Dengue fever. Starvation. Dehydration. Untreated wounds. Sheer exhaustion. Men who had survived the march simply could not survive the camp. Their bodies had been pushed too far. They had nothing left. Survivors described being assigned to grave-digging duty. 30 to 45 men were dying every day, and someone had to bury them. The Japanese initially wanted to cremate the bodies, but American chaplains pleaded with them to allow burials. The Japanese agreed, but only barely. The dead were buried in mass graves just outside the camp. Rows and rows of them. Unmarked. Anonymous. Forgotten. But for many prisoners, Camp O'Donnell was not the end of their ordeal. It was just the beginning. The Japanese began selecting men for work details. Some were sent to clear bomb damage in Manila. Some were sent to build airfields. Some were sent to other parts of the Philippines, to Korea, to Taiwan, to Japan itself, to work as slave laborers in mines, factories, and shipyards. The conditions on these work details were brutal. Men were beaten daily. They were starved. They were worked until they dropped. And thousands more died. And then there were the hell ships. When the Japanese needed to transport prisoners to Japan or other parts of their empire, they packed them into the cargo holds of unmarked merchant vessels. These ships became known as hell ships. The prisoners were crammed into tiny, airless spaces below deck. There was no food. No water. No light. No ventilation. The heat was unbearable. Men suffocated. They went mad. They turned on each other in the darkness. And if the ship was attacked by American submarines or aircraft, which did not know there were prisoners on board, everyone on that ship died. It is estimated that over 5,000 American prisoners of war died on hell ships, killed by their own side's weapons, because the Japanese refused to mark the ships as carrying POWs. So let us talk about the numbers. Because the numbers are staggering. Of the roughly 76,000 men who began the Bataan Death March in April 1942, only about 54,000 made it to Camp O'Donnell alive. That means somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 men died during the march itself. The estimates vary because the chaos was so complete that accurate records were impossible. But even the most conservative estimate puts the death toll at around 6,500. Approximately 650 Americans. And approximately 6,000 Filipinos. And then, once they reached Camp O'Donnell, tens of thousands more died. Approximately 1,500 Americans and 26,000 Filipinos died in the camp in just the first few months. Add in the men who died on work details and hell ships over the next 3 years, and the total death toll climbs even higher. By the end of the war, of the estimated 12,000 American prisoners taken on Bataan, only about 4,000 survived. That is a death rate of roughly 66%. 2 out of every 3 American prisoners died. Among the Filipino prisoners, the numbers were even worse. It is estimated that over 40,000 Filipinos died either during the march, in the camps, or on work details. That is more than half. The Bataan Death March was a war crime. There is no other way to describe it. It was a deliberate, systematic campaign of brutality, starvation, and murder carried out by the Japanese military against helpless prisoners of war. And it was not an accident. It was not the result of chaos or confusion. It was a choice. Japanese military culture at the time viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. In the code of Bushido, the warrior's code, death was preferable to capture. Japanese soldiers were taught that to surrender was to dishonor yourself, your family, your emperor, and your entire nation. And so when Allied soldiers surrendered, the Japanese did not see them as men deserving of basic human dignity. They saw them as cowards. As beneath contempt. And they treated them accordingly. But there is also evidence that the Japanese high command knew what was happening and did nothing to stop it. General Homa Masaharu, the commander of the Japanese 14th Army, later claimed that he had ordered the prisoners to be treated humanely. But his subordinates ignored those orders. And Homa did not enforce them. Whether through negligence or complicity, he allowed the atrocities to continue. After the war, justice came. Slowly. But it came. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, also known as the Tokyo War Crimes Trials, began in 1946. Dozens of Japanese military leaders were tried for war crimes. Among them was General Homa Masaharu. He was charged with responsibility for the Bataan Death March. His defense was that he had not known about the specific atrocities, that his orders had been ignored, that he had been too focused on the military campaign to oversee the treatment of prisoners. The tribunal did not buy it. Homa was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death. On April 3, 1946, he was executed by firing squad. But Homa was not the only one. Other Japanese officers involved in the march and the camps were also tried, convicted, and executed. Justice, such as it was, had been served. But for the survivors, justice was not enough. Because the scars of Bataan went far deeper than physical wounds. Survivors of the Bataan Death March carried the trauma of that experience for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares. They had flashbacks. They struggled with survivors' guilt, haunted by the faces of the men who had not made it. Some survivors became bitter, consumed by hatred for the Japanese. Others found ways to forgive, though it took decades. One particularly moving story is that of Marine Private First Class Irvin Scott. Scott survived the march and spent 3 more years as a prisoner of war. In an interview 50 years later, he described witnessing tanks running over his comrades, men being beheaded, others crucified with bayonets driven through their hands and rib cages. It was a level of brutality that defies comprehension. But here is the remarkable part. In the years after the war, Scott came to forgive the Japanese people. He did not forget. He did not excuse. But he forgave. He even drove a Honda Accord with a license plate that read POW, a paradox that captured his complicated relationship with the past. Scott said that one Japanese guard had shown him compassion during his captivity, a small act of humanity in an ocean of cruelty, and that single act had changed him. He could not understand, he said, why other survivors refused to let go of their hatred. But not everyone could forgive. And no one could forget. Lester Tenney was another survivor. He spent the rest of his life advocating for his fellow prisoners of war, fighting for official recognition from Japan of the atrocities they had endured. He became a professor. He became a public speaker. He became a living witness to history. Tenney testified before Congress.
He spoke at museums and universities.
He made sure that the story of Bataan was never buried, never forgotten. He died in 2017 at the age of 96, one of the last living links to that terrible march. And there were others. Ben Scarden, who survived both the march and 2 hell ships, became a professor at Clemson University and participated in the annual Bataan Memorial Death March at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico until he was 101 years old. Paul Kircham, who survived the march in 3.5 years as a POW, lived to be 102 and spent his later years speaking to schools about his experiences. These men refused to let the world forget. They refused to let the suffering and the sacrifice of their brothers in arms be erased by time. And they have been honored. Not just individually, but collectively. In 1989, the Army ROTC department at New Mexico State University began sponsoring the Bataan Memorial Death March. It started with about 100 participants. Today, it draws thousands. Marchers, including active duty military, veterans, and civilians, walk a grueling 26.2-mile course through the desert at White Sands Missile Range, carrying weighted packs, in honor of the men who marched on Bataan.
It is an act of remembrance. An act of respect. An act of solidarity. There are memorials across the United States and in the Philippines. Monuments. Plaques. Museums. Schools named after Bataan survivors. The story is taught in history classes. It is featured in documentaries and books. And it is etched into the collective memory of the American people. But here is what I want you to understand as we close this story. The Bataan Death March was not just a tragedy. It was not just a war crime. It was a test of the human spirit under the most extreme conditions imaginable. And what those men showed, in the face of unimaginable cruelty, was courage, resilience, brotherhood. They held each other up when they could barely stand. They carried wounded men when they could barely walk. They shared what little food and water they had. They refused to abandon their comrades, even when doing so might have saved their own lives. That is what defines Bataan. Not the cruelty of the enemy. Not the failures of leadership. Not even the staggering death toll. What defines Bataan is the extraordinary strength and humanity of the men who endured it. 76,000 men started that march. Only 54,000 made it to the camp. Thousands more died in the months and years that followed. But those who survived, and those who did not, left behind a legacy that will never be forgotten. The Bataan Death March is a reminder of the depths to which human beings can sink. But it is also a reminder of the heights to which we can rise. It is a story of horror, yes. But it is also a story of hope. Of endurance. Of the unbreakable will to survive. These men gave everything. They fought for 99 days on half rations and with obsolete weapons. They marched 65 miles through hell. They endured years of starvation, disease, and brutality in prison camps. And many of them never made it home. But we remember them. All of them. The ones who survived and the ones who did not. We remember their sacrifice. We honor their courage. And we make damn sure that the world never forgets what they went through. This is the Bataan Death March. 76,000 men. 65 miles of hell. And a story that history will carry forever. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please share it. These men deserve to be remembered. Every single one of them.